So what's basically started all the space race back in the 50s, I think it was 1957, the Sputnik was launched by Russia. It was the first artificial satellite, and the Russians were the first to do that. It was called the Sputnik. And when the U.S. saw that, well, they're like, okay, this isn't good, right? They're thinking the worst, like Russia's going to dominate space, they're going to dominate the world. We have to play some catch up. So basically, they poured a lot of money into the space program. So Alan Shepard was the first man from the first U.S. Man to be put into orbit. Actually into space. He was only in, I think that was in 1958, 59. Yeah, it was Alan Shepard. And then John Glenn later on was the first American to orbit the Earth. That was in 1960, 59, 60, I believe. And then, but before that, Russia already had sent cosmonaut. They call them cosmonauts. We call them astronauts. I think it was in '58 that Russia sent the first cosmonaut into space. So they had the first satellite and the first cosmonaut in space before the Americans. So that put a lot of fear into the United States, right? So, like I said, they sunk a lot of money into the program. Yeah, so Alan Shepard, and then they sent up John Glenn, and then that was the start of the Gemini program. That was the one before, I guess the program before the Apollo was the Gemini, and they had different missions. I don't really want to get into all the technical aspect of it, but the Gemini missions were basically the stepping stone to the Apollo missions. Neil Armstrong, he was born in 1930. He died in 2012. He was in the Navy. He was a test pilot too, but in the Navy, he retired in the Navy in 1960. Joined up with the space program. He was on the Gemini 8 mission into orbit. He was basically the first civilian to go into space, because he had been retired from the Navy, so he was just a civilian then. There's a good picture of, here's a book here. It's a good picture of Neil Armstrong right there. It's a book my daughter bought me at Christmas. It's The Life of Neil Armstrong. It's a really interesting book. On the back you can see the Apollo 11. I don't know if you can see it taking off there, 1969. So Neil Armstrong was, I guess you could say he was either a really unlucky guy or a really lucky guy, depending how you look at it. I know he escaped with his life at a few of the, he had a few close calls and escaped with his life on some of the training. Actually, he was testing one of the Moonlanders, and it basically blew up, and he ejected at he only had about a second to spare. He ejected and landed safely with his parachute. That was one of the accidents he had, and other time he was on one of the Gemini missions, and he docked with the other orbiter, and once they docked, started spinning out of control in Earth orbit. Luckily he was able to bring it back under control. So he's had a few close calls, but they say that he was probably the best choice to command the moon lander in Apollo 11. He was always the most calmest person that anybody knew him. Said he was just calm under pressure and didn't freak out or anything. So I guess he was the best pick for that, because flying that thing and trying to land it on the moon was, I think most people would have been freaking out probably, but he did it, and he became the first man on the moon. So basically, like I said, the Gemini program, and there was a few other programs, start the ball rolling for the Apollo missions. Basically 6 missions to the moon that landed on the moon. There was Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. 17 was the last mission in 1972. Of course, you probably all heard of the Apollo 13 mission, where there was a disaster halfway to the moon. One of the air tanks blew up, I guess, and caused a chain reaction. And to make a long story short, they aborted the mission. And they came back to Earth. They basically barely made it back. They made a movie about that too. They did fly around the moon though. They kept going, and they used the moon's gravity and that to push them back towards, to get a slingshot back towards Earth. But yeah, they made it back by the skin of their teeth. You can look that up. It's a long story. It's a bit of a long story I won't get into, but that was the one. That was basically the only really disaster going to the moon, was that, and that was Apollo 13. Now there was other Apollo missions before, like kind of basically started Apollo 7. Apollo 7 was basically, they tested some of the equipment in Earth orbit, and then just to make sure everything was going to work. And then Apollo 8, they actually flew to the moon in Apollo 8. 3 astronauts. They didn't land on the moon, they just flew there and you know, orbited the moon for a little while, and then they came back safely. So that was good. That was Apollo 8. Apollo 9, again, they were testing the equipment, the moon lander, and the docking. They had to do some docking exercises, and they wanted to test all that. So that was Apollo 9. That was orbiting the Earth. They didn't leave the orbit of the Earth in Apollo 9. Apollo 10, they flew to the moon again, and they actually tested out the moon lander. They didn't land, but they tested it out, all the docking. Basically, there was 2 parts to the whole ship. Once they got rid of all the rockets, all the Saturn V, once they got close to the moon, the way the moon lander was attached to the orbiter, they had to disconnect, basically turn the lander around and redock. It's just the way it was put together. And then 2 of the astronauts would climb into the lander, while the other astronaut would basically fly the orbiter around, and they would leave and go down to the surface of the moon. Well, Apollo 10, they wanted to test all this. They didn't land, like I say, they didn't land on the moon, but they it was basically a big test for the Apollo 11, and it was successful. They redocked, and then everything was good, and they came back to Earth, and that was Apollo 10. So then Apollo 11, that was the big mission where they're going to land on the moon. And that was 1969. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Michael Collins was the commander of the orbiter, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climbed into the lander, and they landed, and they had a successful landing. One of the things was kind of neat. The Apollo 11, so the lander and the orbiter, when they were together, they weighed, I think it was around 30 ton that they weighed. I think the lander weighed around 15 ton. I think it was like 14 or 15 ton, the lander that landed on the moon. If you look at the videos or any of the pictures, it actually doesn't look that big, but it was actually pretty big. Of course, when they blasted off, the whole thing didn't blast off. The legs and the eagle part, like the part of it itself, the base and all that, stayed there, and the pod that they were in just blasted off and went back to the orbiter. So all that stuff they left up there, like the moon buggies are all there, all the stuff they didn't need, they just left it there. So, I mean, they couldn't take it back. It would have been neat to bring back one of the rovers or one of the moon buggies, but they just didn't have it was just too much weight to blast off. So somewhere on the moon right now, there's quite a bit of junk we left there. And they left any waste and all their experiments and all their equipment, whatever they didn't need, is still sitting on the moon. And the flags, like one of the arguments on the flags, you hear people arguing that they didn't fly to the moon because if you look at the flags, they're fluttering in the wind. Well, actually they're not. There is a little bit of actually solar wind on the moon. The solar wind that actually, but the reason the flags, if you look at the flags, they actually had a rod in the top of the flags to keep them, open. Otherwise they would just fall over, right? So to make them look like they were blowing in the wind, they had the pole and then like a top part, like a pole that stuck out that they hung the flag on. So that's why you see the flags. When the Apollo 11 lander took off from the moon, you can see the flag fall over. They put it too close to the lander. So it got knocked over, but the other missions, the flags are still standing there apparently. So Canada actually has a bit of a connection to the Apollo missions, which is kind of neat. I know some of the astronauts, they flew them up to Sudbury, Ontario to do some rock, because I guess they used to call Sudbury the moonscape. Because of all the mining and stuff that goes on up there. It kind of looked like the moon in some places, so they went up there and they did some exercises and some practicing, testing, and exploring some of the rocks. So that was Sudbury, Ontario. I think they also went to Iceland maybe too, Iceland or Greenland, and did some work up there. There was a Quebec company too that was involved with the Apollo missions. They made the moon landers, they made the legs and designed some of the leg work for the legs, the shock absorbers. Trying to think of the name of it. I'm probably going to botch the name. It's a French name. It's in Quebec somewhere. Haru Devtex. It's still a company. It still exists, I believe. Probably saying that wrong. I think it's like Heroux. Devtex. Like Haru Devtex. Excuse my French, please. It helped design the legs and for that, and I think they still do designing for some space, the aerospace industry. So that was a Quebec company that did that, and there was some engineers too at the time. 1950s, the Avro Aero was a program in Canada where we designed a jet fighter. There's a big story about that. I won't get into it. Basically, the Canadian government canceled the idea. They destroyed all the remaining planes. It was the Avro Aero. It was at the time one of the fastest fighter jets in the world. There's a lot of politics involved in the cancellation of that. But anyways, there was a lot of bright engineers, so after that were looking for work. So NASA recruited, I think, 13 or 14 of these bright engineers to go work for them. So they were all Canadians. That was kind of neat. One of them was, I think he was a BC native from BC. Can't think of his name right now, but he actually, it was his idea to have two. First, NASA thought they were just going to send a spaceship there, like one spaceship, fly, land on the moon, and fly back. But it was this guy's idea, this Canadian, to make two, make the orbiter and the lander separate, and have the orbiter just orbit the moon while the lander landed on the moon and came back and rendezvoused with the orbiter. So that was basically his idea, and he got to work on that and design it. And that was a Canadian. No, James Jamerlin was his name. James Jamerlin that was his idea for the two-ship idea, and he was from Ontario, Sarnia, Ontario, I believe. And then there was another guy. Actually, when they came back from the moon, Apollo 11 missions, when they flew back to Earth, or they came back to Earth, people were worried about if there was any kind of bacteria they brought back or some kind of moon germs from the moon. They weren't sure, so the 3 astronauts had to be in quarantine for a few days when they came back. So there was a doctor from Canada. He was from BC actually. His name was William Carpenter. And he was one of the doctors that stayed with the 3 astronauts when they came back and monitored their health and that. But he was Canadian, so it was kind of a neat Canadian connection with the Apollo missions that people don't really know about. So the #1 question right now is, should we go back to the moon? Now NASA is talking about going back in 2024, which is like about 4 years away. They want to go there again and basically build, I guess you could say, a space station there on the moon. Not sure if that's going to happen, but they're pretty adamant that they're going back in 2024. We have the new SpaceX program taking off right now. They actually use one of their SpaceX rockets to send 2 guys up to the space station there. I think it was last week actually. So that was a successful mission. And then you have the NASA LSS, which stands for Space Lifting System, I believe. So NASA's getting back into the program with the SpaceX Falcon Heavy space rockets. It's the first time since the space shuttle program was put on the shelf that they used their own rockets to get to the space station. They've been relying on Russia and their rockets to get to the space station. So hopefully NASA's getting back on track with some missions. The space shuttle program was started up, I guess, in the early 80s. Had quite a few successful missions. Of course, they had some disasters too, with 2 of the space shuttles blowing up, one on takeoff, one on re-entry. and that was a sad time in the space industry. So the space shuttle was shelved in I think it was like 2011 or sometime before that, or around that time. And so it's nice to see them getting back in the game with these some of these other private. Some of these places are like a private companies that are getting into the space program and teaming up with NASA. And their next mission, they say by 2030 they want to fly to Mars. Not so sure about that. They've already sent some rovers there and explored it. Personally, other than it's just to say that we went, I don't really see a lot of sense of going to Mars. We know what's there. Like I said, we've already sent rovers, and they did a lot of exploring, so they're actually still exploring right now. Some of them, I think they're still going. There's a few rovers they sent there. But I think it would be kind of neat to go back to the moon, and definitely the technology would be a little better than it was in 1969. And the video would be a little bit better. Especially Apollo 11, it was the cameras were unfortunately a little bit grainy. The technology got a little bit better on the following missions. But what do you guys think? Do you think we should go back to the moon, or is it a waste of money? It would be a lot of money, but with these private companies getting on board, they seem to be able to do it a little bit cheaper for some reason than the government. I know the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he wants to put more money back into the space program, so that's encouraging for them. Just let me know what you guys think of of going back to the moon or going to Mars, and what do you think about the whole Apollo missions? I only touched on a little bit of it, of the missions. I mean, you can look all that stuff up, and I've read quite a few books and watched documentaries about the missions, the Apollo missions. I just think it's fascinating that we were able to do that in 1969 with the little bit of technology we had at that time, and to do that was just amazing to me. So it's a little bit different topic than talking about tractors and farming and logging and all that stuff, but it's a neat topic, and I hope you guys enjoyed my last video of the walking around the gardens and a few little things. I'll have to do that again because my garden is growing more than it was even a week ago. But we'll do that sometime, and we're going to talk about the next subject. Hopefully we'll be talking about a little down to earth, literally. We're going to be talking about tractor pulling and a little bit of the history of tractor pulling in Canada and the United States, and why I love going to tractor pulls, and we'll explore that a little bit. And hopefully you enjoyed this video, and thanks a lot for watching, guys, and we'll talk to you soon. Oh, I feel like there's somebody watching me. You ever get that feeling?